The cemetery was silent except for the sound of broken sobs echoing through the misty morning air. Victoria Sterling stood frozen behind an ancient oak tree, her designer heels sinking slightly into the damp earth as she watched a man she had never seen before kneeling at her father's grave, weeping as though he had lost his own flesh and blood. Before we dive into this incredible story that will change the way you think about grief, connection, and the unexpected ways strangers can become family, please take a moment to hit that like button below and subscribe to our channel. This story is one that needs to be heard, and your support helps us continue sharing these meaningful tales that remind us of our shared humanity. Now, let's continue with Victoria's story. Victoria had come to visit her father's grave as she did every year on the anniversary of his death. For 5 years now, she had made this pilgrimage from her penthouse in Manhattan to this quiet cemetery in the small town where she had grown up. Each year, she arrived early, before the sun had fully risen, wanting these moments alone with her father without the intrusion of the outside world. She was the CEO of Sterling Industries, a billion-dollar empire her father had built from nothing, and these were the only moments in her impossibly busy life when she allowed herself to be vulnerable, to be just Victoria, not the ice queen the business magazines called her. But this year was different. Someone else was there. Someone who clearly had no business being at Richard Sterling's grave. The man wore a janitor's uniform, the kind with a name patch sewn onto the chest, though Victoria was too far away to read it. His shoulders shook with the force of his crying, and in his weathered hands, he clutched a small bunch of wildflowers, the kind you might pick from the side of a road. They looked pathetic next to the elaborate arrangement of white roses Victoria had ordered from the most exclusive florist in the city, which had been delivered and placed at the grave the evening before. Victoria felt a surge of indignation rise in her chest. Who was this man? What right did he have to be here, at her father's grave, crying as though he had any claim to the grief that belonged to her? She had half a mind to march over there and demand he leave immediately. This was her private moment, her sacred tradition, and this stranger was intruding on something deeply personal. But something held her back. Perhaps it was the raw genuineness of his sorrow, so unlike the measured, appropriate sadness she saw at the corporate memorial events held in her father's honor each year. This man's grief was unfiltered, unashamed, the kind of crying that came from somewhere deep and true. Victoria waited, her own tears for her father frozen somewhere inside her chest, unable to fall while this stranger occupied the space that should have been hers alone. Minutes passed. The man finally composed himself enough to speak, his voice barely above a whisper, but in the stillness of the morning, Victoria could make out some of his words. "Thank you, Mr. Sterling. Thank you for saving my life. I promise I'm doing my best. I promise I'm trying to be the father Tommy deserves. I just wish you were here to tell me if I'm doing it right." Victoria's breath caught. Tommy. A child. This man had a son. And somehow, impossibly, her father had saved this man's life. But how? When? Her father had died 5 years ago from a sudden heart attack in his office. In the chaos of grief and suddenly having to take over the company, had she missed something important about the kind of man her father had been? The janitor stood slowly, his knees creaking with the effort. He placed the wildflowers gently at the base of the headstone, right next to Victoria's expensive roses. For a moment, he just stood there, his hand resting on top of the cold marble, as if drawing strength from the contact. Then he wiped his eyes with the back of his hand, straightened his shoulders, and began walking toward the cemetery exit. Victoria remained hidden behind the oak tree until he was out of sight. Then, on shaking legs, she approached her father's grave. She looked down at the two bouquets, so different yet placed side by side. The contrast struck her as symbolic of something she couldn't quite name. Her roses were perfect, expensive, ordered by her assistant because Victoria had been too busy with a merger to pick them out herself. His wildflowers were humble, but they had been chosen by his own hands, placed here with his own grief, watered with his own tears. She knelt down, her designer suit be damned, and for the first time in 5 years, Victoria Sterling allowed herself to truly cry. Not the few elegant tears she had permitted herself at the funeral while cameras flashed and board members watched. Not the private, controlled weeping she did in her office late at night when the weight of her father's legacy felt too heavy. This was something different. This was the messy, gasping, soul-deep crying of a daughter who missed her father so much it felt like a physical wound that would never heal. When her tears finally slowed, Victoria noticed something she had never seen before. At the base of the headstone, partially hidden by the flowers, was a small laminated photograph. She picked it up carefully. It showed a young boy, maybe 7 or 8 years old, with a gap-toothed smile and bright eyes, holding up a certificate of some kind. On the back, in neat handwriting, were the words, "Tommy's Honor Roll Certificate." I wish you could have seen him receive it. You would have been so proud. Victoria's hands trembled as she held the photograph. This was a ritual, she realized. That man came here regularly. This wasn't his first visit. He brought updates about his son. He shared his life with her father the way she should have been doing, but hadn't, because she had been too busy, too consumed with keeping the company thriving, too afraid that if she allowed herself to feel too much, she would shatter completely and never be able to put herself back together. She pulled out her phone and took a picture of the janitor's uniform company logo she had glimpsed. A quick search told her it was Brightway Cleaning Services, a company that serviced several buildings in the area. Finding this man suddenly became the most important thing in the world. She needed to know the story. She needed to understand the connection between her father and this stranger who mourned him like family. But as Victoria sat there in the early morning light, she realized something else. She needed this connection for herself. 5 years of running her father's company, 5 years of being strong and decisive and never showing weakness, 5 years of slowly transforming into someone she barely recognized when she looked in the mirror. She had employees and board members and business associates, but did she have anyone who truly knew her? Anyone she could be vulnerable with? Anyone who understood what it meant to carry the legacy of someone you loved and lost? The next day, Victoria did something she had never done before. Instead of sending her assistant to handle it, she personally called Brightway Cleaning Services. She used a fake name, claiming she was looking to hire someone for a private job and had been impressed by one of their janitors but hadn't caught his name. She described the man she had seen at the cemetery. "Oh, that sounds like Daniel Torres," the woman on the phone said cheerfully. "He's one of our best. Very reliable, very thorough. Works the early morning shift at the Riverside office complex." Daniel Torres. Now she had a name to go with the grief. Victoria made another unusual decision. The next morning, instead of going straight to her corner office at Sterling Industries headquarters, she drove to the Riverside office complex. It was a modest building, nothing like the gleaming skyscraper where she worked, but respectable. She parked her Tesla in the visitor's lot and waited. At 6:30 in the morning, she saw him. Daniel Torres, pushing a cleaning cart, his uniform clean and pressed despite its obvious age. He moved with quiet efficiency, his action speaking of someone who took pride in his work, no matter how humble others might consider it. Victoria got out of her car, her heart pounding. She had faced down hostile corporate takeovers, negotiated billion-dollar deals, given speeches to thousands of people, but approaching this janitor felt more daunting than any of those challenges. What would she even say? "Hello, I saw you crying at my father's grave and I have questions." It sounded invasive, inappropriate, crazy. But before she could lose her nerve, Daniel looked up and saw her standing there. Their eyes met across the parking lot. There was no recognition in his gaze, just polite acknowledgement of another human being. He nodded respectfully and continued pushing his cart toward the building's entrance. "Excuse me," Victoria called out, her voice sounding strange even to her own ears. "Mr. Torres?" He stopped and turned, surprise flickering across his face at hearing his name. "Yes? Can I help you?" Now that she was here, face to face with him, Victoria felt her carefully practiced words evaporate. She opened her mouth, closed it, tried again. This is going to sound very strange, but I was at Riverside Cemetery yesterday morning. At Richard Sterling's grave. The change in Daniel's expression was immediate. Color drained from his face, and his hands gripped the handle of his cleaning cart tightly. "Oh God," he said quietly. "You saw me. I'm so sorry. I know I probably shouldn't go there. I have no official connection to Mr. Sterling. I needed." He trailed off, looking down at his feet. "No," Victoria said quickly, stepping closer. "Please, don't apologize. I'm not here to tell you to stay away. I'm here because I'm Victoria Sterling. Richard Sterling's daughter." Daniel's head snapped up, his eyes wide with shock. You're Victoria? Mr. Sterling's little girl?" "Not so little anymore," Victoria said with a small, sad smile. "But yes. And I need to know, Mr. Torres. I need to understand. How did you know my father? What did he do for you?" Tears immediately sprang to Daniel's eyes. He blinked rapidly, trying to control himself. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to intrude on your grief. I know he was your father. I had no right." "Please," Victoria interrupted, and there must have been something desperate in her voice because Daniel stopped talking and just looked at her. "Please, I'm not angry. I just need to know. You said he saved your life. I need to know that story." Daniel glanced at his watch. "I need to finish my shift. I can't afford to lose this job, and if I'm late. What if I paid you for your time?" Victoria said immediately. "Double whatever you make in a shift. Triple. Just talk to me. Please." Daniel studied her face for a long moment. Whatever he saw there must have convinced him of her sincerity because he nodded slowly. "I get off at 2 o'clock. There's a diner 2 blocks from here, Rosie's. Do you know it?" Victoria didn't, but she nodded anyway. "I'll find it. 2 o'clock. You don't have to pay me," Daniel added quietly. "If you're really Mr. Sterling's daughter, if you really want to hear about him, I'll tell you everything. It would be my honor." Victoria spent the hours until 2 o'clock in a state of distraction she hadn't experienced in years. She cancelled her morning meetings, claiming a personal emergency, which sent her assistant into a panic because Victoria Sterling never cancelled meetings for personal reasons. She never even acknowledged having a personal life that could generate emergencies. At exactly 2 o'clock, Victoria walked into Rosie's diner, a small, worn establishment that smelled like coffee and frying bacon. It was the kind of place she hadn't set foot in since before her father's death had transformed her into someone who only ate at restaurants that required reservations weeks in advance. Daniel was already there, seated in a corner booth. He had changed out of his janitor's uniform into jeans and a clean t-shirt. He looked younger out of the uniform, maybe in his early 30s. There were lines of worry on his face that seemed too deep for his age, but his eyes were kind. Victoria slid into the booth across from him. A waitress appeared immediately, and Daniel ordered coffee. Victoria, who usually drank overpriced lattes from the cafe in her office building, ordered the same. They sat in awkward silence for a moment until the coffee arrived. Then Daniel wrapped his hands around his mug and began to speak. 6 years ago, I was in a very dark place, he said quietly. My wife, Rosa, had just died from cancer. We didn't have insurance, and the medical bills had bankrupted us. I had a 4-year-old son, Tommy, who had just lost his mother. I was working 2 jobs trying to keep us afloat, but I was drowning in debt. Every day, the bills piled higher. Every day, I felt like more of a failure as a father. Victoria listened without interrupting, her coffee growing cold in front of her. One night, I was working my second job as a janitor at Sterling Industries. It was late, maybe 2 in the morning. I thought the building was empty. I was cleaning the executive floor, and I broke down. I sat on the floor in that hallway and cried like a baby. All the grief I'd been holding in, all the fear and exhaustion and hopelessness, it all came pouring out. Daniel paused, his eyes distant with the memory. Your father found me like that. He was working late in his office. He heard me crying, and instead of calling security to remove me, he came and sat down on the floor next to me. This billionaire, this titan of industry, sat on the floor in his expensive suit next to a sobbing janitor he'd never met before. Victoria felt tears prickling her eyes. She could picture it so clearly. That was exactly something her father would do. Before the company had consumed all his time, he had been the kind of man who saw people, really saw them, no matter their station in life. He asked me what was wrong, Daniel continued. And I don't know why, but I told him everything. I told him about Rosa, about Tommy, about the debt, about how I was working myself to death but it still wasn't enough. I told him I didn't know how I was going to keep my son housed and fed. I told him I was terrified that child services would take Tommy away from me because I couldn't provide for him properly. What did he do? Victoria asked, though she was almost afraid to hear the answer. He listened, Daniel said simply. He didn't interrupt, didn't offer platitudes or tell me things would get better. He just listened until I had said everything I needed to say. Then he asked me if I loved my son. I told him Tommy was the only reason I was still alive, the only thing keeping me going. Your father nodded, like that was the answer he expected, and then he said something I'll never forget. Daniel's voice became thick with emotion. He said, "A man who loves his son the way you clearly love yours deserves a fighting chance. Let me help you." I tried to refuse. I wasn't looking for charity. I don't know what I was doing. Falling apart, I guess. But your father insisted. He asked me how much debt I was carrying. When I told him, he didn't even flinch, even though it was more money than I'd make in 10 years of working. Victoria's hand went to her mouth. He paid off your debt. Not just that, Daniel said, and now tears were flowing freely down his face. He paid off Rosa's medical bills, paid off the mortgage on our little house, and set up a trust fund for Tommy's education. He said no child should lose their chance at a future because they lost their mother. Then he got me a job with better hours and better pay through a company he had connections with. He made sure I could be there for Tommy, could be the father my son needed. He never told me, Victoria whispered. I had no idea. He asked me not to tell anyone, Daniel explained. He said he didn't do it for recognition or tax write-offs or PR. He did it because it was the right thing to do. He said he had a daughter around Tommy's age when he started his company, and the thought of her growing up without him was unbearable. He understood what Tommy was facing. Victoria had to look away, blinking rapidly. Her father had been there for this stranger's son in ways he had increasingly not been there for her in the final years of his life. The company had grown so large, so all-consuming. They had still loved each other, but the easy closeness of her childhood had been replaced by scheduled dinners and business discussions.